Good morning, everybody. Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics, meeting number 109. Pursuant to Standing Order 1083H7, study of breach of personal information involving Cambridge Analytica and Facebook. Today with us, Christopher Wylie via teleconference in UK. So thanks for coming, Mr. Wylie. And I think sorry, we don't have sound.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can now. So you've been made aware that we're going to have you sworn in today?
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to do that right now. Go ahead, John.
So please repeat after me. I, Christopher Wylie,
Christopher Wylie,
do solemnly and sincerely and truly affirm and declare.
Sorry, say that again.
And truly affirm and declare.
And truly affirm and declare.
The taking of any oath is according to my religious belief.
The taking of any oath according to my religious belief.
Unlawful, and I do solemnly.
Unlawful, and I do solemnly.
Sincerely and truly affirm and declare.
Sincerely and truly affirm.
And declare that the evidence I shall give on this examination.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
And declare that the evidence I shall give on this examination.
And declare that the evidence that I shall give on this examination.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wylie. And it's unfortunate, again, that you couldn't be with us today, but we understand you're testifying in the UK with the current case that's before Parliament in the UK. So we appreciate it would have been nice to have you here, but we realize your obligations over in UK. So we'll start off. Would you like to have any opening comments, Mr. Wylie?
No, I'm happy to take questions.
Sure. We'll start off with first question goes to Mr. Erskine-Smith. 7 minutes.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Mr. Wylie. First, just short question is, can you confirm how long you worked for Cambridge Analytica?
Yeah, so well, if your question has to do with Cambridge Analytica precisely, or are you talking also about SCL Group?
Both.
Both. Okay, so I was the director of research, and I started my engagement in July of 2013 with SCL Group, and I completed that engagement around the end of October or November of 2014.
Okay, and just a couple of quick confirmations. Cambridge, and by the way, when I say Cambridge Analytica or SCL, I'm going to refer to them both together. So Cambridge Analytica SCL worked on the Brexit campaign for Vote Leave and related campaigns, and in the U.S. election on behalf of President Trump. Is that correct?
Yes, to my understanding, yes.
And to your knowledge, these campaigns used the information improperly collected by Kogan from Facebook users?
I did not work on the Trump campaign, so I cannot speak specifically to what specific data was used or not used on the Trump campaign. But what I can say is that the foundational modeling and data assets of Cambridge Analytica were derived from the Kogan data set that you're referring to.
And we had Chris Vickery start us off here at our committee, and he indicated there was this master data set that included a number of different points of information, from U.S. election lists to the RNC Trust to even he referenced the Koch brothers. We've got one example that really was the foundation for why we started this study, which was the Cambridge Analytica improperly collecting information through Kogan from Facebook. Do you have other examples that you can point to of improper collection of personal information by Cambridge Analytica or SCL?
The most concerning misappropriation of information relates to Facebook data in the United States. However, I am also aware that in other countries, the company, whether it was under the auspices of SCL Group or under the auspices of Cambridge Analytica, did attempt to misappropriate other data sets. But to be clear, those data sets weren't necessarily Facebook or social media data sets, those could have been government records or private company records, for example. So my understanding is that, as to give you an example, in Trinidad, my understanding is that there was an attempt to procure online browsing histories of citizens, for example.
And is the idea
Which, as I understand, sorry.
No, it's just the idea then is to compile all of this information from as many sources as possible into one master data set. That's the idea?
Yeah, so that's what you call the database of record, or the DBOR. So the idea of a DBOR is to create what you would call a single citizen view or a single customer view. The more information that you have from different contexts about a person, the more you are able to accurately infer their behavior. So if you have a data set that shows their consumer behavior, you're able to predict certain facets of that person. If you also have online data, so whether it's social media data or clickstream data or cookie data, you're able to see another facet of that person, etc. So the idea of a DBOR is to create a holistic view of a person so that you can more accurately predict different facets of their behavior.
And in understanding that person, again, Mr. Vickery suggested there were very personal aspects of people's lives. The example that he pointed to was, quote, leading a biblical life, whatever that might mean, but that was a way that people were tagged. In your view, what's the most personal information that you saw in these databases that was acted upon?
It depends on the definition of most personal. I guess that's relative to each person what they consider most personal. But for me, to give you some examples of things that I think most people would consider highly personal, so religious views, for example, sexual orientation, for example, even the fact that the wider data sets were being used to infer attributes in people related to their psychological disposition, which they may or may not have known or wanted to be inferred. So if you are inferring, for example, some sort of psychological neurosis in a person, that may feel very sensitive and very personal, even if that data wasn't necessarily collected as such, but rather inferred from the other data that was collected. So the issue is not just what observations directly were acquired in data sets, but also what less intimate observations that were observed can then how they can be transformed into inferred information about things that would be quite personal to a person.
And in your view, you've mentioned it could be used for a range of different purposes. We've been dealing with political purposes to a large degree at this committee, but the information that you saw collected for a range of different purposes, including from political parties, perhaps, that was put into this master database, was information collected for political purposes or from election lists? Was that used for commercial purposes?
My understanding, so when I was there, the primary focus after the Mercers and Steve Bannon took over was for political purposes. But I do know that there was planning to do commercial projects, and I believe that the company subsequently did perform commercial work for various companies. But to be clear, I didn't work on specifically commercial projects simply for a company itself.
And my last question is in relation to custom audiences. So just practically for the sake of Canadians, but our committee, when you have this personal information about people and you want to target people, presumably you are creating a custom audience and then uploading that custom audience to advertise to that custom audience. Perhaps explain just the mechanics of how this works.
Yeah, so a custom audience is what Facebook would call a list of particular people that have been identified externally to create your target universe. So there's two ways essentially that you can target on Facebook. One is using Facebook's own targeting applications. So picking, for example, different likes that you want to target, or, I want to target people in Alberta but not Saskatchewan, that kind of thing. But that doesn't involve specific lists of people. It just involves attributes, and then Facebook goes and pulls people who match that attribute. So in that process, you don't actually engage what you'd call PII, personally identifiable information. The other way that you can target ads on Facebook and other sites like Facebook is through custom audiences, which is where you have a list of people that, for whatever reason, whether that's because of an algorithm or simply because of an observed attribute that you want to target, you upload a list of specific individuals from your own database into Facebook, and then Facebook only targets those individual people. So that involves that directly involves the management of PII.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Next up for 7 minutes, Mr. Kent.
Thank you, Chair, and it's good that you could be with us here today, Mr. Wiley. You are certainly a whistleblower of some note, and your comments a couple of months ago saying it's extremely uncomfortable to consider that our democracy may have been corrupted have resonated and sparked investigations like our committee today. But I would also note that you have been, over the years, a participant, an architect, if you will, of the dark art of psychographic micro-targeting, and in some ways, I think, comparable to the arsonist who sets the blaze and then calls the fire department. On January 2nd, 2016, you sent an email to Mr. Cummings, who you had briefed on the plan, the project for the Leave project, the Brexit vote, the referendum in the UK, and followed up asking for an early meeting to consider the proposal that you made. Again, as you said, your in-depth technical briefing on psychographic micro-targeting. But you also said in that email to Mr. Cummings, some of us will be in Ottawa this month, January 2016, working on a similar project for a major Canadian political party. We know now that that was the Liberal Party of Canada, and I'll come back to that later on in my questions over the next couple of hours. But I'd like to go back a decade and just establish a little bit of ground information. Is it correct that you worked in the office of the Liberal leader under Stéphane Dion and Michael Ignatieff between 2007 and 2009 and launched a project that was, pardon me, that was described as information management?
Yeah, so I worked for the Office of the Leader of the Opposition, and my role went at the time frame that you said, and my role was to look at ways of using information technologies to better engage and communicate with constituents and manage constituent information. So is that?
Yes. Well, and is it true then that your pardon me, your contract was canceled at the direction of Leader Ignatieff because he considered your work to be too invasive of Canadians' privacy?
That is news to me. If that happened, I never heard about it. So I don't believe that's true. No.
Well, Canadian press quoted a Liberal insider, pardon me, saying that you were pushing a fledgling form of data harvesting techniques. But Liberal officials then backed off because they didn't want to have anything to do with what they considered as potentially too invasive.
I don't know who this Liberal insider is, so it's hard for me to comment on what exactly that they're referring to. When I worked with the Opposition Leader's Office, the project was primarily infrastructural. So at the time, the opposition caucus did not have a coherent constituency casework management system. I think that managing casework is a legitimate activity for members of parliament and the leader of the opposition to engage with, and creating technological infrastructure to help them respond to constituents more promptly, I think is a perfectly legitimate exercise to engage in. And to the point that you made, I to my recollection, I was never terminated because of some kind of privacy issue. So I'm not sure where you're getting that information, but I don't believe it's true.
Well, in this case, it was from Canadian Press, but the Globe and Mail reported that as a Liberal volunteer and researcher, you played a role in introducing and shaping the party's drive towards data-driven techniques. And this gentleman said, again, this volunteer said that you were using fringe techniques, using a now widely used piece of software known as Liberalist, while aggressively avowing to the party's old guard that only technology
is just a brand name for the CRM technology that was being developed. The thing that I would say is that just because data, the one thing that I would just caution anyone looking at this issue is that the use of information in and itself is not inherently nefarious. So every party in Canada uses a CRM system. Every party collects data. At the time, the Conservative Party had much more advanced technology and data collection infrastructure than the Liberal Party. And in order to keep up with the modernization of politics, one of the things that the Liberal Party at the time prioritized was setting up a CRM system to manage relationships with voters, and then on the caucus side to manage relationships with constituents. That in itself is not nefarious, and that in itself is not illegal or unethical. Every party collects the electoral register in Canada and collects information on constituents or voters. So I
Absolutely. Every party does collect data. It's a matter of how much data they collect and how they use it. use it. Pardon me. Now, coming back to this email that you sent at the time you were pitching the Leave Vote psychographic micro-targeting, and your line saying, some of us will be in Ottawa this month working on a similar project for a major Canadian political party. Were you pitching basically this same approach to the Liberal Party of Canada in January 2016?
So let me be clear. So first of all, if you read through the documentation that was sent to Dominic Cummings, nothing in there is illegal, and nothing in there is necessarily comparable to, for example, Cambridge Analytica. So there was no proposal to misappropriate data. If you collect data with awareness and consent, then that is a legitimate use and collection of data. So the thing that I would just caution again is simply because data is involved in a project, it does not mean that there is any nefarious intent or purpose for that project. With relation to
Thank you, Mr. Kent. Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Mr. Wiley. Yeah, we'll come back. Next up for 7 minutes, Mr. Angus.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Wiley, for joining our committee today. I'm very interested in the structure of SCL. We're trying to figure out SCL, Cambridge Analytica, Aggregate IQ. And when I look at SCL, I mean, they were involved in psychological warfare, rumor campaigns. They got paid by NATO. They were working around the world. Then they seem to have morphed into this election machine. Can you explain the structure of SCL to us?
Sure. So something that might interest the committee is that I believe that in fact, some of the work that SCL was doing for NATO was actually funded by the Canadian government. So something that you might be interested in looking at with the Department of Defense in Ottawa is that relationship there. In terms of the structure of SCL, it had several iterations over time. So when I was there, it was considered a group company where you had the same set of shareholders and board members on several different companies which shared the same name, SCL, and then each of the companies within the group company specialized in a different area of work. So the largest at the time when I joined was SCL Defense. So the majority of the work that SCL Group did was defense-related. You also had SCL Elections, which was a much smaller consultancy that did elections work, usually in developing countries. SCL Social, which did work that usually didn't fit into either defense or politics. So, for example, if you had a healthcare project, that might be SCL Social, and then SCL Commercial, which did commercial projects. When Cambridge Analytica was set up, the formal relationship that it had when the intellectual property was transferred was from SCL Elections to Cambridge Analytica. So Cambridge Analytica was set up in the United States. It acquired not SCL Elections itself, but merely the intellectual property of SCL Elections. So SCL Elections assigned its IP to Cambridge Analytica. Cambridge Analytica, in return, provided a license to that same intellectual property back to SCL Elections with a second contract which guaranteed that all work from Cambridge Analytica would be performed by SCL Elections. So that was sort of the basic setup. I can go into more detail if you'd like.
Well, we will get there. So Brittany Kaiser testified that Aggregated IQ was the exclusive digital data engineering partner of Cambridge Analytica. Yeah. And Chris Vickery also stated that they were the digital development team. So how does Aggregate IQ fit in here?
Okay, so in around the end of October or November of 2013, when SCL decided to scale and sort of prioritize development of technology solutions, I reached out to Jeff Sylvester and Zach Massingham and asked if they were interested in coming and working on projects in London. But because they had new families and they were sort of already established in Canada, it was difficult for them to move. So the arrangement was that they would set up a Canadian company. They would be able to work in Canada, and the front-facing brand would still be SCL or SCL Canada, but they were able to remain in Canada as they worked. So Aggregate IQ was set up. The first project that they worked on was Trinidad. The arrangement that they had with SCL was that any work that they performed for SCL would then be owned by SCL. So the intellectual property that was being developed at the time was then assigned or transferred to SCL. So you could sort of think of Aggregate IQ a bit like a franchise, if you will.
Okay, so we have the documents, and I think they were probably supplied by you, that SCL identifies Zach Massingham as head of SCL Canada. There's a phone that goes to Zach Massingham as the head of SCL Canada. He said there's absolutely no connection. Is that credible?
No, that's completely false. So the reason why Aggregate IQ was set up in the first place was because there were projects that SCL was running, and then later Cambridge Analytica was running, that they needed a team of engineers to support. And the arrangement was that Aggregate IQ would perform that work and then exclusively license it to SCL, and then operate under the auspices of SCL Canada. So
why would Zach Massingham tell our committee such an obvious falsehood when there's documents? That's the question that we don't understand.
I can't speak to what the intentions or reason why.
But you have
Zach
said that
Massingham
what they sorry to interrupt, but you have said that they've been very careful, technically correct in what they say, but they use weasel words. Why would you say that?
So the reason why I said weasel words is because it is technically true that Aggregate IQ was not SCL, was not part of SCL technically, because it was a separately registered company in a separate country. However, the intellectual property licensing arrangements and the contractual arrangements and the development work were all exclusive with SCL. So whilst the reason I said that is because it is very, very, very technically true that Aggregate IQ is a separate company, but that doesn't mean that the intellectual property that it was developing, it owned. SCL owned the intellectual property that it was developing.
Sorry, just to close this off, but you also said that they were a proxy money laundering operation in the Brexit Leave campaign. Did you not say that?
So when you look at the relationship that Aggregate IQ had with many of the different campaign groups on the Leave side, and that all of those different campaign groups all received donations, in some cases very, very sizable donations from Vote Leave, where that money then all went to Aggregate IQ, to me that looks like a proxy for breaking campaign spending law in the United Kingdom. And so the issue that I have, and in fact Facebook recently confirmed to the Electoral Commission and to the British Parliament that in fact Aggregate IQ had some of the same custom audiences and lookalike audiences that were based on their work for Vote Leave for some of these other entities. So what has been established so far is that money went from Vote Leave to another campaign and went to the same service provider for the same work that Vote Leave had, and Facebook has now confirmed that in fact some of the targeting and the target universes were the exact same. So I don't know, if calling it money laundering per se is the technically correct way of expressing that relationship, but in the general sense, it does look like the relationship that it had with all of the Leave campaigns was to obfuscate electoral law in the UK.
Thank you, Mr. Angus. Next up for 7 minutes, Mr. Bayliss.
I'm just going to add a little correction to what you said about the money moving from Vote Leave to one of the other ones. What we were told by Aggregate IQ is they didn't even bother passing it over. They just gave it directly to AIQ. So in that sense...
Sorry, you're correct. What I meant by passing the money around is that the invoices...
Yeah.
You are correct. Vote Leave did, in many cases, provided the money directly.
They didn't even trust them to give them the money. They just said, send the invoice to them and we'll pay it, yeah.
Yeah, so, sorry, I stand corrected. The invoices were different, but the money did,
They didn't even bother sending the money. That's how coordinated they were. I'd like to talk to you, starting off right at the beginning of this issue, Lukoil and the Russian government. Lukoil, as we know, is run by a gentleman, Mr. Alek Perov, who was a former minister in the government. We know that this company is under U.S. government sanctions because it's seen as an arm of the Russian government. So when I talk about Lukoil or I talk about the Russian regime of Vladimir Putin, I'm going to be referring to him as one. They start off by connecting with Mr. Kogan. Can you explain those connections between Mr. Kogan and the Russian government?
So, Dr. Kogan, at the time that he was engaged by SCL, he was also working on Russian-funded projects out of St. Petersburg on profiling social media users with a particular focus on two things: One on online trolling and trolling behavior on social media, and then secondly, with a focus on what you call dark triad traits, so narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. SCL was aware of this work, so it is documented in emails that the company wanted to pitch Alex Kogan's work for the Russians to its other clients. He was there giving talks, as I understand it, both about the work that he was doing at St. Petersburg, but then also referencing some of the work that he was doing in for SCL in the United States. With respect to Lukoil, around the same time, Lukoil then approached SCL/Cambridge Analytica with a particular interest in targeting. Discussions were had about the Cambridge Analytica's experience in rumor campaigns and disinformation. That is documented. There were presentations, which I've handed over to the authorities, that reference that.
I want to hold that thought for a second. So Lukoil, this theoretical oil company, shows up at SCL, and they want to talk about rumor campaigns, attitudinal inoculation, things we could call fake news. Would that be a global catch-all?
Sure. That's sort of a new way of calling it. It's disinformation.
Let's call it fake news. That seems to be the word now.
Sure.
Why would Lukoil be interested in fake news or spreading fake news?
So I can't speak to what Lukoil's intentions were in terms of those meetings. I do know that when SCL made presentations about disinformation or attitudinal inoculation, that did not dissuade the company from continuing that relationship. The company was interested. They then received white papers that myself and colleagues had composed on the data assets and capacity of the company in the United States.
If I could say, at this time, at this stage, you've got Lukoil, which I'm going to call the Russian government, trying to spread fake news and learning about, I need a database, so I'm working with Mr. Kogan to get a database, and I'm financing him, Russian government, Lukoil, and then I'm also talking to SCL about how do I spread that fake news now that I've got this database. That's going on. And then something interesting happens. Two people from the United States show up, Mr. Steve Bannon and Robert Mercer. What now? The big players in the internet are all American-based. This technology to target people is, as you mentioned, Canadians can do it, Americans can do it. How did Steve Bannon and Robert Mercer know that this was going on? That there was this group working with the Russian government that was stealing data and then looking at spreading fake news. How did those two gentlemen show up, Steve Bannon and Robert Mercer, to this little company in Cambridge?
I wasn't present for the first couple of meetings. My understanding is that Steve Bannon was introduced to Alexander Nix by a mutual acquaintance. At the time, he was the editor of Breitbart and was a follower of what's called the Breitbart Doctrine, which is that politics flows downstream from culture. So if you want to change politics, start with culture. Breitbart obviously was not expanding into a mainstream media outlet as it was envisioned to, and so he was looking for a way of expanding his arsenal of tools to engage in what he would call culture war. So the appeal of SCL Group when he was introduced to the company was that it worked on information operations for the U.S. military, for the UK military, other militaries.
Could we say an appeal might be also that they happen to have something unique that wasn't available in the States? Could we say that one of the appeals is that they had a Russian that had stolen a lot of data that they could put to work? Could we say that that might have been a unique aspect that brought them to go there?
So just a small correction on the timelines. The Kogan project began after Steve Bannon took over the company, but it was authorized by Steve Bannon. So just in terms of the timeline, the work that Alexander Kogan engaged in happened once Steve Bannon and Robert Mercer acquired the IP in SCL, set up Cambridge Analytica, and then deposited the fund in order to fund it.
The work, the actual scraping of the data. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So it was. So that means
that means that they knew that he was working with the Russians. They show up there and they know he has a special skill set to scrape data. Who would have told? Is it possible the Russians let them know about it? Is it possible that? Did you ever see a link between Mr. Bannon, Mercer, and Lukoil directly, or is there any hint of that?
Well, Steve Bannon had to approve all of the projects that the company engaged in. So, as the vice president, he was in charge of managing the operations, on a day-to-day kind of basis, albeit in the United States. So, any kind of new client, new project, or new stream of work, particularly if it incurred a cost, would have to go and be approved by him. So he was aware.
Thank you, Mr. Benson.
Sorry, go finish up. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Finish your
So
answer.
he was aware of the work that was going on. He was aware of Dr. Kogan's work, and he approved the financing of it. Because to put it to highlight the scale of it, the company spent close to $1 million in the first 3 months of that project. So that had to be approved by Steve Bannon and the Mercers.
Thank you, Mr. Wiley. Next up for 5 minutes, Mr. Gord.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wiley, I'd like to go back to the beginning of your technology. When you started out, was creating the architecture of your technology, was it a blank slate, or were you inspired by other existing technologies that existed somewhere else in the world?
When I first got engaged by SCL Group in the summer of 2013, they were looking at modernizing a lot of their activities and work, particularly as it related to what was happening in the defense community, which was an expansion of research into the proliferation of ideas online and social media, because that was fast becoming one of the primary recruitment tools of extremist organizations and terrorist organizations. The company had a deficit in technical expertise, and it wanted to expand that. So when I came on board, it was in part to look at the operations of the company and figure out how can they modernize their tactics and use technology to improve that. When I started, there wasn't you could call it a blank slate in the sense of the technological infrastructure was not yet there. It was not a blank slate in the sense that the company had several decades of experience working in information operations around the world, and so part of the role, at least initially when I was invited to join the company, was to look at existing tactics and techniques in information operations and see how we can port that into cyberspace.
Monsieur Wiley, comment une technologie militaire se transforme?
Mr. Wiley, how could military technology be transformed into a tool for an election campaign within a democracy? Were third parties placing orders? You didn't do this just for your own pleasure. Were there people who were prepared to pay for this technology?
Be clear, when I was first engaged by SCL, I became research director for multiple companies, so it wasn't just the elections division that I was working on. Looking at the research that we were doing originally wasn't necessarily just for elections. There would have been military applications for it. And at the time, military work was the bread and butter of the company. So, but it was around that time that Alexander Nix met up with Steve Bannon and began that process of engaging with Bannon and the Mercers to essentially port that over into an electoral context in the United States.
Donc, Monsieur Wiley, est-ce que c'est des partis politiques?
So, Mr. Wiley, was it political parties who approached your company to help them with the technology, or did your company approach the political parties to say, we have a tool that could potentially assist you in your search for voters?
It's usually handled the relationships with clients or prospective clients. So I do know that he went out and met with several prospective clients, mostly, I believe, in Africa or the Caribbean, some, I think, in South America and in Asia, about some of the work that was being done. But I wasn't necessarily present in those meetings, so I can't speak to that.
Donc, vous confirmez que votre...
So you're confirming that your company specialized in various different countries to go out and see people to help them prepare their elections. So this was all set up specifically for a global market to influence the democratic exercise.
So the part of the work that the company did was to go into other countries and work in elections campaigns. So, in particularly in emerging democracies, and the way that the company often made money was not necessarily from working in elections, but rather using the relationships that it builds in those campaigns later for government projects.
Thank you, Mr. Gordon. Next up, Ms. Vanderbilt.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here to answer our questions. I'd like to go to something that you told the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee when you said that where you really drew the line, one of the things that caused you to blow the whistle on this was because they were starting to engage in voter suppression, particularly targeting people based on their race. And I'd like to just, if you could explain what it is exactly, when you're talking about voter suppression, what is it that they were proposing or did do?
So, to be clear, I didn't work on voter suppression projects. I was made aware of them whilst I was there. My understanding of what the company was intending to do, I believe at the instigation of Steve Bannon and some of his colleagues in different PACs, was to create lists of predominantly African American voters and then look at what types of messaging would disengage them from politics further, which would then reduce the likelihood that they would vote. So there's different definitions of voter suppression. The most egregious form would be to actually go and try to deregister people to vote, or what's called vote caging. That's not what I'm talking about. What I am talking about is finding things that will make politics so unappetizing or confusing to a subset of voters that they become less inclined to actually vote or engage with the democratic process.
And this is based on these psychosocial behavioral profiles that are gathered from, I mean, as you mentioned, not just Facebook, but potentially private companies, potentially from different sources, browsing histories, things like that. There's this aggregate of data that is being collected that's allowing this kind of work?
Yes. So the data would be sourced from multiple origins. Some of it was commercial, some of it was electoral, and some of it was social or online.
So one of the things that you just told us is that the intellectual property of Aggregate IQ, so a lot of this data that's being collected, that aggregated, is actually exclusively owned by SCL. There's a data sharing arrangement. But when Mr. Vickery was here, was testifying before the committee, he said a similar thing. He said that he found on the servers of AIQ data where the code base looked like it was exactly the same. So suggesting again that SCL and Aggregate IQ were sharing their data completely. And yet when we had Mr. Sylvester here, he said that all they had access to was potentially some ranking scores that came from the US that might have come from an SCL server somewhere. So you're saying that what Mr. Sylvester told us is not accurate, that in fact there was a much closer arrangement between SCL and AIQ?
So in order for the technologies that AIQ were developing to work, right? So what they built was the interface between databases and online platforms that you could put advertising on. So they were that sort of middle ground. You need to have access to the data in order to pull lists, in order to then send it to create a custom audience. So you can't build a targeting platform that doesn't have access to data, because then what are you targeting on, right? So one of the things that I provided to the DCMS committee here in Britain is an email from AIQ that specifically references searching the SCL databases on the Ripon project. So I don't know how else you can query a database if you don't have access to the database. I do not know how you can perform targeting if you do not have access to the database. So I do not, and frankly, I'm surprised and really disappointed that Jeff Sylvester and Zach Massingham have decided to try to obfuscate or hide what happened. And you'll have to ask them why it is that they are taking this line. But in my view, that's just not true. What value would they offer then if they did not use any of the data?
And actually, that's my next question, is when people are engaging SCL or Cambridge Analytica or Aggregate IQ, when particularly for elections, what are they buying? Because what we were led to believe through Aggregate IQ is that it's like a Burma shave. You just put a little thing on Facebook, and they were just the ones that put the ads based on some demographic data on Facebook. And if somebody waves at you on the street, or the same thing as putting a like, they were just gathering that, and that was all they were doing. But £600,000 for a single contract, just so that someone can go and target some people on Facebook, which most people, any volunteer, could probably do. You're suggesting that what they were really buying was access to this aggregated database, this psychosocial profiling, the vast amount of data that was collected. That's what people were buying into.
So, with respect to, I appreciate your very, very Canadian political term, Burma shave. I haven't heard that in a long time, actually. The thing that I find farcical about the line that all Aggregate IQ does is just click some demographics on Facebook Ad Manager and that's it. Well, the problem that I have with that is that I'm like, well, what is the value of your company then? All you're doing is something that an intern could do, right? If you know that you want to target, women between 25 and 30, you can tell your intern to go and do that. So I don't understand why you would need, it would be a lot cheaper also, because you wouldn't have to be paying for all the consultancy fees. So to me, that's just farcical as an explanation, unless they are grossly incompetent or I don't know that if Vote Leave was just that stupid, but having met Dom Cummings, I don't think he is. And so I find that really, really hard to believe. And one of the things that, Facebook has gone out and confirmed is that actually a lot of these different campaigns were all using the same custom audiences for targeting. So it's like, I don't understand that explanation, and I can't speak for them, but for me, I don't buy it.
Thank you, Mrs. Vanderbilt. Next up for 5 minutes, Mr. Kent.
Thank you very much. And just coming back, Mr. Wiley, you mentioned the technical briefing that you gave to Mr. Cummins and the Brexit Leave campaign. And in that, you, and certainly all Canadian political parties collect data, but we don't collect the sort of deep data that would allow what you describe as with a deep understanding of underlying cognitive and dispositional processes, we can get to the heart of why people are driven towards almost any behavior. You talk about personality psychometrics, vulnerabilities, really, of individual voters who you say sometimes lie to themselves about what they want to do or the choices they want to make. But I think the most telling line is at the end of your briefing, you say, this is because we can trigger the underlying dispositional motivators that drive each psychographic audience. And you, again, claim at the beginning of this technical briefing that you would engage, your multinational team combines years of experience in micro-targeting and psychographic profiling in British, American, Canadian, and international politics. You know, so again, and this comes back again to Canadian Press, a reliable source of news in Canada, which reported earlier this year that an acquaintance of yours, off the record, not identified.
Which is who, though? I can't. It's hard for me to comment on somebody who claims to know me or what happened on that. You know, if they don't have, if I don't have their name, if I don't know why they said that.
Well, this acquaintance said that had drinks with you.
Let's be clear. I don't know if they are an acquaintance or not.
Well, let me describe the situation, and you may recall. This acquaintance said he or she had drinks with you in Ottawa in November 2015, a few weeks after the federal election. And the same acquaintance was quoted by Canadian Press as saying, you were shopping your Facebook data mining techniques in Ottawa with the Liberals and in Washington with the Republican Party, and that you discussed with this acquaintance your ethical concerns. Is that inaccurate?
Let me be clear. That is not accurate. Let me just be super clear right now. That is not accurate. I was not in the United States at that time pitching the Republican Party. You are happy. I welcome you to ask the RNC if I was there doing that. That's just not true. In terms of Facebook, so I don't even know where to begin with this. So when you are looking at underlying motivators of people, for example, that does not mean that you have to do anything nefarious. So, for example, if people are more extroverted, for example, they like things that are that have a higher audiovisual content in them. So you might want to send them something that is more flashy or more fun, compared to somebody who is more introverted, who might want to read something more in depth, if they're conscientious, for example. So there isn't what I would just caution people is to twist anything to do with data or anything to do with the underlying psychology of voters into something nefarious when it doesn't necessarily have to be. Now, to be clear, the Liberal Party, the work that I did for the LRB, so to be clear, I didn't work for the Liberal Party. I haven't worked for the Liberal Party in I don't know how many years, but a long time, since before I moved to the UK. The work for the LRB was simply helping them when they were transitioning, because this was the time that the government was just being set up, on looking at caucus communications, looking at basic metrics on things like Twitter, what people are talking about, and there was nothing nefarious about that. To be clear, I haven't worked for the Liberal Party or any Canadian Liberal entity on psychographic targeting. So let me just be super clear. Any insinuation that I have done that is just untrue. I have not worked on psychometric-based targeting for the Liberal Party or any Liberal entity. So
even though you told Mr. Cummings that you did, I mean, you said in this email from you,
the reference that you're making is discussions that I was having about what could be done. But my
Well,
my
just to be
role,
clear, you said specifically you referred to the in-depth technical briefing on psychographic microtargeting, and you also said some of us will be in Ottawa this month working on a similar project for a major Canadian political party. Were you misleading Mr. Cummings?
No. So let me be clear. I did not work on a project related to psychographic targeting for the Liberal Party.
Well, let's move on then.
And that's the end of it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, we'll continue a little bit later. Thank you.
Next up for 5 minutes, Mr. Saini.
Good, I guess, afternoon to you, Mr. Wiley. Just a quick question. This is something regarding the testimony that you gave last week, and it was with Senator Whitehouse. It's an exchange that you had with him. And in response to a question from Senator Whitehouse last week about AIQ and SCL Canada, you stated, and I quote, "There are subcontractors that were set up during the time that I was there to build out software infrastructure," end quote. As I'm sure you know, they completely deny being set up in order to serve SCL or Cambridge Analytica. Can you go through the process or give us an idea of what was undertaken to set them up in as much detail as you can?
So my understanding is that Aggregate IQ as a company was only very recently set up before the first contract that they engaged in. So that's something that could be checked, actually, is when the company was actually set up. Because before that point, Jeff Sylvester and Zach Massingham were working in other companies. So they left to form this company so that they could then work on SCL-related projects. So that perhaps is a question better placed to Aggregate IQ, as they would have the company documents for that. But they started working under the auspices of Aggregate IQ once they were offered substantial projects in the Caribbean, in Africa, and then later in the United States. So the contractual arrangements that were made was that the intellectual property that they would be developing, that SCL was paying for, would be owned by SCL.
So just to touch on that point. So AIQ was set up because you had an initial conversation with them about potential work. So prior to that, there was no AIQ. There were just two guys, and they had no.
Yeah, that's my understanding.
So AIQ was set up because you had that initial conversation with them, and you said that there is some work that we would like you to do, and you had the discussion about them coming to England. But as you stated, they were recently, or they had families, and they recently purchased a home, so they would have preferred to work with your company solely, but do it in Canada.
Yes.
Okay. So the next question is, and this is in front of the UK committee, you noted, and I quote, "If you can bill as several different companies, but it is the same team working on it, the paperwork looks compliant, even if the project is not," end quote. To your knowledge, was there any discussions between SCL and or Cambridge Analytica with AIQ regarding the intentional flouting or circumvention of domestic laws or any sort of expenditure-related rules, and if so, what were the nature of those discussions?
What I can say is that work was performed in the United States by Aggregate IQ, by SCL, and by Cambridge Analytica, and oftentimes those were for various PACs or campaigns or other electoral entities that were working in the same state, same region, or same electoral context. But as to the specific discussions that AIQ has had with SCL, you'll have to ask AIQ. But one of my concerns was that the setup of this arrangement would allow the various entities collectively to perform work that they otherwise would not be allowed to had the regulator known that it was the same people just wearing different hats. The company SCL and Cambridge Analytica actually received legal advice on this and on other matters related to compliance in the United States, and I'm not confident that they followed through with that advice. AIQ's work in the United States, potentially is questionable if they were, for example, sending non-American citizens down to advise or manage a campaign contrary to FEC rules and American law.
Okay. I have several questions, but I'm going to ask you a shorter question. Also, and this is for your testimony last week with Senator Whitehouse, you noted that the RIP-On tool was created in order to use the data harvested by Alexander Kogan. Do you find it credible that AIQ wouldn't have been aware of the fact that we're building this tool and for what purpose?
Oh, they were fully aware. They came to the UK all the time. I think they might have even met Alexander Kogan. I'm not sure exactly if they have or not, but I recall them being there when Alexander Kogan was in the office also. So, I
would have been aware.
I find it difficult.
Sorry, go ahead.
I find it really difficult to believe that they went through an extensive contracting process, an extensive technical specification, and did not understand the specification that they were co-writing.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sandy. Next up for 3 minutes, Mr. Angus.
Thank you, Mr. Wiley. I want to ask you about a conversation you claim to have had with Jeff Sylvester that he remembers differently. And you did swear under oath, so I just want to make sure that what you said was accurate, because you'd stated in other testimony that they, AIQ, Jeff Sylvester, conceded to me, and this is a verbatim quote, and I stand by it. I remember Jeff Sylvester telling me that what they did was totally illegal, that AIQ was used as a money laundering vehicle. Is that true? That conversation, did that happen?
Yeah, it happened in the spring of last year in Victoria, British Columbia, and the words "totally illegal" I distinctly remember. Well, so I stand by my recollection of that.
Okay, we asked Mr. Sylvester about it, and he said he was very surprised that you said that. He said it was a misunderstanding, and that he wrote a text to you expressing that he thought it was a misunderstanding. Would that be true?
No, that's not true. I have all of the text messages from Jeff Sylvester at that time, and I absolutely do not recall him correcting his statement via text message.
Would you share?
I don't believe that for a minute.
Would you share those text messages with our committee? We're not interested in what you talked about the Blue Jays or Liverpool, but whether or not he was concerned that he had been misrepresented to us is very important.
Sure, absolutely. So what I'll do is I'll speak to my lawyers and we'll find the best way to provide you with the information that you would like.
Well, thank you very much. Again, I'm concerned about the role of AIQ and various other roles with Cambridge Analytica. And we asked about the murder video in Nigeria. And to their credit, it seemed that AIQ was very upset when they received the murder video. Who gave them the murder video?
So the video that you're referring to is a video that shows people being dismembered. It has highly Islamophobic messaging in it. And Cambridge Analytica, I believe actually via a contractor, created that video and then sent it to AIQ for distribution. So AIQ did not create the video.
No.
However,
and to their credit, they seemed very upset by that video. But what surprised me was that Zach Massingham said at our committee that he didn't know that Cambridge Analytica existed during the Nigeria campaign, so he didn't understand which made me wonder, well, then who gave them the video if it came from Cambridge Analytica? How did he not know?
That cannot be possibly true. I'm sorry, that just can't be true. To not know who your largest client is
He's got a phone. He's got a phone that he didn't know he had. So I just want to get this on the record. So you're saying that it's absurd that in the Nigeria campaign that this video originated with Cambridge Analytica. It was handed to AIQ, but AIQ said that they didn't know Cambridge Analytica existed.
I don't, unless they're, I don't know. I'm frankly shocked that he said that because they were the largest client of AIQ. So I don't know how the CEO of a company doesn't know who your largest client is.
Well, I'm just going to close this off because we have to go on, but how is it, I'm worried with Mr. Massingham, is he taking the fall for somebody? Because why would someone totally misrepresent a simple fact like that?
I honestly, I'm actually speechless that he said that. I honestly have no idea how to explain that. I think it's unfortunate because there's a lot of information that I think is really important for people to know about, regulators to know about, legislatures to know about, and they had every opportunity to participate in, blowing the whistle, and they decided not to. So you'll have to ask him that. I find it absolutely shocking that he didn't know what Cambridge Analytica was when it was their largest client.
Thank you, Mr. Wiley. Just so everybody knows, we're going to go into the next round right away. We're supposed to go there's possibly a time allocation vote that's going to happen within about 20 minutes. So just hang in there, Mr. Wiley. We're going to start. We're going to keep going as much as we can. I don't know if you're okay. Do you need a health break or anything like that, Mr. Wiley?
I'm okay.
You're good to go. So we'll continue as scheduled with Mr. Picard for 7 minutes.
Mr. Wiley, je vais prendre quelques détails de votre.
Mr. Wiley, I'd like to take a note of some of your testimony, and I'd have a few follow-up questions. Why do operations here in Canada, given the international nature of your clientele, why was Canada made the choice for AIQ and SCL? Was this practical reasons, or were they more financial in nature?
That's where Jeff Sylvester and Zach Massingham lived and wanted to stay. So they wanted to participate in SCL projects, but they had the the temporal and geographic constraint of being in Canada rather than moving to the UK, and so the company accommodated that.
La nature des données.
The nature of the data that you worked on. Well, if I draw an analogy to cooking, creative cooking allows you to create a number of dishes, but you don't really need to know the source of the information. What was the source of the information? We don't have that detail. The fact that you work on something that you're provided with and you're paid to do the job, that's one thing. However, the function of sourcing the information, was that your choice or was that given to you?
To sourcing the information, are you referring to the Kogan project? Is that what you're referring to?
Allez-y en général, parce que.
Well, just a general response. A Kogan file is a very special one, of course, but you obtain information from various databases or data sets. You have to acquire it. It's not just falling out of the sky. You need some kind of agreement with a supplier of sorts, a source of sorts. So there's many dimensions to that. Does the supply of this data or information come from the initiative of the owner of the data? For example, Facebook has various databases. They provide you access or lend them to you or sell them to you. Or do you offer to purchase, or perhaps they're hacked?
And this is not intended to be a difficult answer. It's just it depends really on the project and the data source that you're talking about. So, for example, the Facebook data set was acquired by Alexander Kogan using apps from Facebook. There were other data sets that were acquired. Some of them were acquired at the instigation of the owners of those data sets. So, for example, clients would sometimes provide the company with information to help that modeling process. In other cases, there would be a contractual relationship directly with a company. So, a data vendor that sells consumer data, for example, or a company that sells its customer lists And then in other cases, subcontractors would be used to go and acquire data generally, depending on what they go and find. So, for example, Aggregate IQ was sometimes tasked with finding data sets for particular projects. So they did that in Trinidad, for example. So they went out and acquired data on behalf of the company. Sometimes it's a contractual relationship directly with a data vendor. Sometimes it's an application that collects data. There's a lot of different ways that you can collect data.
Dans le cas du dossier Brexit, vous sembliez sur...
In the Brexit case, you seem surprised that the nature of the information on which you were working was relatively the same, regardless of which party was involved. Usually, when one is looking to manipulate data for political ends, and we're talking Brexit, you were in the Caribbean and Africa and the U.S., the interest in massaging this information or manipulating it for political ends will have a result on the results of an election. Usually it's whoever is looking to be in power or control the group that will be in power. Are you aware of any foreign interest that might want to gain power in other countries using this technology?
So I'm aware of projects where clients from one country would be interested in the government or electoral results in another. To my understanding, SCL did participate in projects where some of the funders would not be nationals or residents of the country that they were operating in. So, for example, you have companies, for example, which might be interested in the natural resources of a particular country, and one government versus another may be more conducive to that. So I am aware of the company generally engaging with members of other countries or nationals of other countries for a project in a separate country.
You parlé tout à l'heure de vote suppression.
You spoke briefly on vote suppression and vote changing, or deregistering an electoral list, for example. The operation of removing names from the electoral list, did this ever occur through AIQ, SCL, or any other entity?
So I'll be super clear. When I'm talking about voter suppression, I'm not speaking about vote caging or literally removing people off of the electoral register. What I'm talking about is targeting particular groups of people with messages that will disengage them or frustrate them or confuse them, which ultimately will in some cases inhibit or demotivate them enough to not participate in an election.
Alors ma question était, est-ce que vous avez participé à du vote caging?
Okay, I'll repeat my question. Were you involved in any way with vote caging?
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Picard. Next up for 7 minutes, Mr. Kent.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Wiley, coming back to your associations with the Liberal Party of Canada, Braden Cayley, a Liberal Party spokesman, told Canadian Press in an email that the party did not contract you to do any work after staffers met with you in January 2016. And a spokesman for Prime Minister Trudeau, Chantal Gagnon, told CP in a separate email note, Mr. Wiley did some preliminary work for the Liberal Caucus Research Bureau, but ultimately it was decided not to move forward with his services. What then were you paid for the $100,000 you received in January 2016? What services, were those services rendered before the 2015 election or in 2016?
So the work that I did so first of all, it wasn't, I haven't worked for the Liberal Party of Canada in terms of the political party.
Bureau, I understand, the Research Bureau.
Yeah. So the Research Bureau at the time was looking for ways to optimize caucus communications, looking at ways of responding better to constituent communications, and also providing the caucus with ongoing information as to, for example, what people are speaking about on Twitter. So a lot of the work that I did in relation to the LRB was actually, and it is appropriate, the word preliminary, because they were just setting up, it was a new government at the time, and so they were just setting up the office. So they wanted help with who should they be hiring, what should they be doing, how should they be collecting, insight to inform caucus meetings when they're talking about issue X or issue Y, and more broadly, how to optimize communications with constituents. So, for example, managing correspondence and things like that. So, a lot of that was to help them as they were setting up, as they were transitioning into government, and as they were hiring out their staff. I didn't want to, become a staff member, and I didn't. It wasn't necessarily something that I envisioned doing for a long time. But the work that was done, wasn't, necessarily groundbreaking or anything. It was just to help the LRB during that transition process.
Do you think the Liberal Research Bureau is working on its own without your continuing services to develop psychographic micro-targeting in the next election?
So, again, to be clear, there wasn't, the work that was being done did not involve micro-targeting. So, because the role of the LRB is not an election entity, it's to support the work of the caucus, right? So the focus of the LRB is to look at policy issues and find out things like, what are people talking about when, if our next meeting is going to focus on Northern affairs, what are people talking about and what do they think, so that you can have a more informed caucus discussion. So you can do that either by hiring a lot of interns to go through and pull out examples of tweets and things that people care about, or you can do it programmatically. Or you can hire somebody to then go and build it and do it programmatically.
But to achieve what you said again, triggering the underlying dispositional motivators that drive each psychographic audience, you need much more than a name and an address and a phone number and an email. You need what you go into in quite specific depth, additional information on personality vulnerabilities and so forth, to be able to, as you say, drive a voter to where they may not know they want to go. Is that not correct? Isn't that basically what...
I wouldn't necessarily agree with your characterization of it. It is very well known in behavioral research that people often do not have insight into some of their own behaviors. So, for example, if you ask people, how much do you smoke, how much do you drink, or how many vegetables do you eat, you typically get responses that are not actually reflective of the actual behavior. So it's important, depending on the context of the work that you're doing, sometimes it's important to find other indicators that are more reflective of the behaviors that you're interested in. So for example, in voting, a lot of times people will say, I'm unsure as to how I'm going to vote. That doesn't mean that they won't have a consistent voting behavior. It just means that at the time they haven't thought about it and they're not going to necessarily give you a helpful answer. So if you can find other indicators of that, that's all that means. There's nothing nefarious about it, and I can guarantee every party in Canada goes and does modeling projects that looks for indicators in voting behavior.
But
so the Liberal Party does that, the Conservative Party does that, the NDP does that.
But they don't gather data of the sort improperly harvested from Facebook, which show prejudices, biases, vulnerabilities, which were obviously used by AIQ in the Vote Leave campaign, the Brexit campaign, and reportedly in American elections.
Sure.
So do you
sorry, what is your question?
Well, the question is, if the data that's acquired is beyond the name, the email, the phone number, I mean, the basic voter ID that all parties, you're quite right, do, and which we use to get out the vote. But I don't go looking, and I'm certainly, don't believe my party goes looking for the vulnerabilities of the voters in my constituency to try and change their opinion or to try and change their their voting intention because of the vulnerabilities that may be indicated by improper harvesting of data elsewhere. Sure,
and nor does the LRB, and nor does the Liberal Party, at least at the time that I was there.
So do you believe that, or you seem to believe that, contrary to your statement that it's uncomfortable to consider our democracy may have been corrupted, you don't believe that psychographic microtargeting corrupts our democratic electoral process?
If used properly. So there's, again, this is why I keep stressing, just because data or psychology is involved does not mean that innately there is something nefarious going on. You know, there is a problem around the world, in Canada also, with voter disengagement, right? Fewer and fewer people turn out to vote, right? And it's because there's a new media environment that is distracting, people are disconnected with politics, and oftentimes it is very helpful to understand, again, underlying motivators for people so that you can improve turnout, you can improve voter engagement, and you can speak to people in a way that motivates them and wants them to participate. So that is a use case which is not nefarious. It is a positive use case because you are looking to increase turnout and increase participation in your democracy. So just because data is used or just because psychology is used does not mean that you are going to seek out misappropriated data. It does not mean that you are out to manipulate or coerce or somehow trick or suppress voters. It just means that you are looking for information to help you engage those people.
Okay, well, thank you. Certainly your technical briefing would seem to be, if not nefarious, it would seem to suggest unethical manipulation of voter intention.
Well, I disagree, and that briefing was sent. That briefing was sent to the Information Commissioner's Office and the Electoral Commission. I proactively gave it to them, and there is nothing in there that is illegal or goes outside of the bounds of the law.
Thank you, Mr.
So I disagree with you.
Thank you. Next up for 7 minutes, Mr. Angus.
Mr. Wiley, I'm very interested in your analysis of the role of SCL that worked with Cambridge Analytica and Aggregate IQ on some of these international projects that I believe you referred to as a form of new neo-colonialism. Would you say that that's the correct term that you used, or did I get that wrong?
Yeah, so I've had several conversations now with governments or representatives of governments in different countries. And one of the things that has become very apparent is that you might have a country that gained independence and the former colonizer left, but corporate interests didn't. And so what I mean by neocolonialism is rather than state action or government action to control via a governor the affairs of a particular country, you have large multinational companies or wealthy individuals from oftentimes the former colonizer coming in and seeking to interfere with the elections in a way that resources, for example, can continue to be extracted. In a way that is conducive for business interests in that former colonizer. So what I meant by that is that colonialism still happens in a lot of these places. It just doesn't look like the form that it did, 100 years ago.
Right. No, I think this is fascinating because I'm looking at the work of SCL, Cambridge Analytica, AIQ in Nigeria, Trinidad, elsewhere, and it's like some kind of Frederick Forsyth novel with cyber geeks. So I just want to go through a bit of this. So in the Nigeria campaign, there was the question of this video, the murder video that was to incite ethnic hatred. That was brought forward by a Cambridge Analytica operator that was supposedly given to AIQ. In Trinidad Tobago, there's allegations that illegal data was collected and harvested, the de-anonymizing of, I think, emails, was that correct? And AIQ was involved with that?
Clickstream data. Internet browsing history.
Right, browsing history, right. And so AIQ worked with Cambridge Analytica for SCL on those projects?
Yes.
Okay. And you had stated that this is a company that's gone around the world and has undermined democratic elections in all kinds of countries. and they could not care less as to whether their work is compliant because they like to win. That's correct on SCL and the culture that came out of Cambridge Analytica and Aggregate IQ?
That was the impression that I got when I was there.
And so the Canadian government paid SCL to run psychological operations in Latvia, and said that SCL...
The NATO Stratcom Center.
The NATO Stratcom Center. And it was promoted by Canadian Ambassador Alain Hauser and the Latvian Secretary of Defense, that they would use the SCL team of experts in target audience analysis. Would that be somewhat similar to what they could have done in Brexit, this target audience analysis? Can you explain that?
Yeah, so target audience analysis, or TAA, is what military is the starting points for information operations in a military context, and it's something that SCL specialized in. So the idea of TAA is to if you take a step back for a moment and look at information operations as a military endeavor, is part of what's called a multidimensional battle space, where you as a military client are trying to seek out dominance in all of those spaces, whether it's land, sea, air, space, or indeed information. So TAA is the starting point where you look for the information space around your target and identify weaknesses or vulnerabilities in that information space, whether to deny your opponent information or whether to provide them with information which is conducive to your operational objective.
I guess I'm interested because, what the part of the tail of this big dog that we've grabbed is the illegal end. And so we just see these guys as dodgy operators who are out to do dodgy things. And yet they get hired by NATO to do dodgy things on behalf of the Canadian people. And now they've morphed into Aimer Data, that seems to be all the same players, but they also include financial links to Blackwater, the mercenary group, and they worked with Black Cube, Israeli Black Ops operators. How are we to navigate a space where a large corporate interest can do completely illegal things in one context and then yet be brought in by governments to do favors for them in others?
So the one thing that I would say is that information operations is not always nefarious, or it's not always a bad thing. So if you think of a conflict...
You said that this is a company that's gone around the world and undermined democratic elections. They don't care whether their work is compliant because they like to win. I mean, this is a corporate culture we're dealing with.
Yes, sorry, I just, a broader point on, for example, projects that Canada funds, for example. Just because Canada funds an IO project does not mean that Canada is intending on undermining democracy around the world. When you look at, for example, counter-extremism, where if you seek to confuse or interfere with the operations or communications of an extremist group or of a terrorist group, that is ultimately a denial of their agency. But in that context, that may be appropriate.
I get that. I guess the question
that is
from
not appropriate
I guess the question for me for legislation is, if we have companies that engage in nefarious, illegal activities, but then we can say, well, the enemy of my enemy is now my friend. How do we legislate companies that seem to be so willing to break the law, but then still get government contracts because it's useful to have them do other work elsewhere? I mean, this is something we need to be talking about, but we haven't really dealt with this. I'm asking your opinion from having worked inside with them.
Right. So I think when you take a step back, Canadians often, and rightly so, think of Canada as a country that goes around the world and promotes democracy, right? So in doing so, you are strengthening civic institutions and you are helping people participate. When you look at actions of Canadian companies, for example, Aggregate IQ, they are doing the exact opposite of that. Canada, as a country, does not know about that activity because it does not require, for example, proactive registration of any kind of activity in a foreign election. So one of the things that I've been speaking to American members of Congress about is in the same way that you have to register foreign agents who are lobbying or conducting work in the United States, you should also have a registry of companies that are doing work outside in other elections or electoral contexts to allow oversight, whether that is government oversight or civic society oversight, of the operations of companies in other elections. I don't know if the Canadian government was aware that SCL also had an elections division. So, one of the things that could be done is better due diligence about what are the other projects and activities that the company that is being contracted by the Canadian government is doing in other places. Simply the question, what other projects have you done in the past 2 years, or are you currently working on, and are any of those political?
Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Next up for 7 minutes, Mr. Erskine-Smith.
Thanks very much. It's great. We've been working in a nonpartisan way, although today Mr. Kent seems to be more partisan than usual. I look forward to him inviting Hamish Marshall to our committee, who said that psychographic profiling is incredibly useful and not for the faint of heart. So, Mr. Wiley, we've identified illegal conduct, I think, or potentially illegal conduct in relation to Brexit and spending, and we've talked about AIQ's role, and they knew at the time that any overspending of a £7 million limit would have caused problems for Vote Leave, and yet they funneled money to other organizations. We know from testimony at the UK committee, from what I understand, that the same custom audiences were uploaded for both the Believe campaigns and the Vote Leave campaigns, yet AIQ had told us, no, the information was provided by the respective campaigns, which quite clearly is now a lie. That's potentially illegal conduct. We've got potentially illegal conduct, or at least contrary to PIFIDA, when Facebook overshared information, potentially even private messages, to Kogan, and Kogan then potentially improperly or illegally passed that on to Cambridge Analytica. Are there other examples of potentially illegal conduct this committee should be seized with or be aware of?
In relation to Cambridge Analytica, or in relation to is it in relation to Cambridge Analytica, or just generally?
To your knowledge, we're talking 600,000 Canadians have been affected by just the Facebook to Kogan transfer, and that's not any other app. AIQ had an app on Facebook itself, and we don't know how much information was gleaned from that. So if we identify the players in this story, AIQ, SCL, and Cambridge Analytica, and you've worked for a fairly long period of time for Cambridge Analytica in a significant role as research director, so from what you have seen, is there other illegal conduct in this story that we should be aware of?
There may be, but I'm also aware that there are currently investigations going on where imparting that information in a public forum may interfere with a particular investigation. So if you'd like to discuss that
so we can spend,
in a non-public forum, then perhaps we could have that discussion.
So perhaps we can, Chair, we can discuss this after the second round, but potentially go in camera at some point. So we talk about profiling and political ads or companies advertised to in a targeted way. And you've, I think, been right to highlight the difference between ethical and unethical uses of data, that it's perfectly acceptable to target some messages to certain people who may be interested in receiving that message. We know political parties do this all the time. In the last election, the Conservative Party targeted Punjabi and Chinese communities to say that our Prime Minister wanted to open up neighborhood brothels and sell marijuana to kids. So we know this happens. But the issue is reach, right? So scale and reach. And so when we talk about what the internet's done and the Facebook example of 87 million profiles being improperly shared, it's just an incredible scale that we haven't yet had to grapple with when it comes to targeting. And when we talk about custom audiences, where we can actually now not just reach communities through particular papers or particular interests, say, this person likes animals or this person likes baseball, we can now actually upload a custom audience and specifically get at these people. So when we look at answers to this problem, I've read your article, Let's Not Delete Facebook, Let's Fix Facebook, and you've talked about transparency. Perhaps you could speak to some solutions that this committee ought to be looking at, given your expertise.
Yeah, so the first thing that I would say is that I am not on a crusade against Facebook. I think that there's a lot of really amazing things that Facebook does. The other thing that I would say is that although a lot of attention is being put on Facebook, there are other social media companies that collect just as much data, or in some cases more data. And when we look at how society is moving forward, this is a one-directional movement, right? We are every single year we are integrating smart devices that are connected to algorithms, that are connected to databases in new and multifarious aspects of our lives. People are putting in Alexa into their homes. Their fridges can connect to their phones. We might have self-driving cars at some point in the future. With the advent of things like facial recognition or smart buildings, physical spaces at some point may be adapting themselves to your presence in them. There's a lot of benefits to that, but there's a lot of risks to that. So one of the things that I think should be considered is more rules on transparency for targeting. So currently, if you as a politician go out and do a constituency event, the media might show up, there's an audience, your opponent might show up, and if you tell an untruth, you can be called out for that, right? Or if you say something and there's a different perspective, there is some kind of accountability mechanism there. That is the essence of the public forum. The problem with targeting is that rather than standing in that public forum, you are going to each individual voter and whispering something in their ear. Now, in many cases, what you're whispering is something that you would be happy to say in that public forum. In some cases, it may not be.
How narrow the custom audience is. So to that point about whispering in one person's ear, custom audiences can be drilled down to what? I can upload a custom audience of one?
Facebook limits a custom audience of 1,000, but you could have 1,000 custom audiences of 1,000s to make up 1 million, and you have 1,000 different messages to 1 million people. The point that I was going to make was that rather than say targeting is outright a bad thing and we shouldn't have it, because there are really positive use cases, particularly with motivating underrepresented groups in democracies to actually show up and vote. Simply requiring platforms like Facebook or Google or Twitter to publish every single ad that is being sent out on their platform that would allow journalists, governments, parties, whomever, to look at what ads are actually being put out on this platform, and in addition to that, the actual targeting specification for those adverts. Currently, we do not know what goes on Facebook. We do not know what goes on Google. We do not know what goes on Twitter in terms of targeted advertising, right? So a simple solution to that would be to require those platforms to simply report what happens so that there can be public scrutiny. In that way, you avoid necessarily creating cumbersome rules to restrict, what you can and can't say on a platform, or having some cumbersome, regulator that would allow civil society and parties to scrutinize messaging just in the same way that they would if you were standing in the public forum. But it would not prevent the really positive use cases of targeting, in particular engaging people who are underrepresented in politics right now.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Just a little heads up. We do have bells at 10:56, and there's a vote at 11:26. So it gives us another half an hour or so, and then we should be able to get back, but we're going to try and get through as much as we can. Mr. Gord for 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Wiley, I think you said that you could be encouraging people to go voting, but the problem is that if you're pushing people to vote, you're pushing them all in the same direction. So why target people on Facebook when ads could be put out in traditional media, on the radio, television, or in the papers?
For example, they're highly mobile. They don't necessarily have, the address on the electoral register is not necessarily where they live. They don't necessarily listen to the radio. And there is something to be said about sending messages to voters where that message contains a policy or an issue that they actually care about. If I am, a person in Nova Scotia, I might be not entirely concerned with, wheat and farming policies in Saskatchewan because what affects me, is fisheries, or what affects me is something else. And so targeting doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. You can have targeting that is positive for democracy because you are speaking to voters about something that they actually care about. And indeed in a medium that they actually see and engage with. The problem, like we have declining turnout. So this is not just a problem in Canada; it's a problem all over the place. It's because the media environment, the media landscape has completely changed. And so, part of the job of political parties in maintaining our democratic process is to adapt to that new environment and to develop ways of engaging voters in that new environment. So digital has to be part of that. If we do not have digital communications in an increasingly digitized society, we are going to we are dramatically going to affect results of elections to people who aren't online, which is a vastly shrinking population. So I think that we shouldn't necessarily treat social media or online communications as a bad thing. Just in the same way that you can have a knife and it can be a murder weapon, or it can create a Michelin star meal. It's a tool. So the appropriate thing to do is to look at what is reasonable for this tool and how to use this tool and create boundaries for that tool.
Monsieur Woolley, avez-vous évalué?
Mr. Wiley, have you evaluated or assessed the number of people who might be able to go and vote in elections through the use of this technology?
Can you be slightly more specific with your question?
Est-ce que vous avez des chiffres?
Do you have any figures that show when this technology is used that would show you how many more people would go out and vote? Would it be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6% more who go and vote during an election through the use of this technology?
Yeah, I off the top of my head, I can't give you an exactly precise figure, but I recall seeing results that ranged from 2 to 7% in terms of increase, in terms of uplift. So, which is not insignificant. So I think that if parties actually focus more on online engagement, you could actually increase turnout overall. But it's the job of all the parties to do that for all of their own supporters and their voters.
Différents sondeurs professionnels disent qu'ils ont
Different pollsters or say that it's difficult to predict trends in an election. So can this even change a lot, say, in the last 10 days of an election campaign? We see major changes sometimes that happen. We're seeing that in Ontario right now. So can these technologies have a huge impact in the last 10 days in the influence of voters who might otherwise simply not even have gone out to vote?
Time predicting because they don't actually do forecasting. All they do is report the results of 1,000 people and what they said. So there's very little analysis that actually goes into it in terms of creating forecasting algorithms or something that would be prospective in the future. So that's one of the reasons why polling has become, drastically inaccurate in a lot of places. But in terms of the impact of the use of targeting, I think that it absolutely could affect the results of an election, 10 days out. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I just think that more parties and political actors should be looking at that problem and at ways that they can engage people on digital platforms. But I think more turnout is a good thing.
Thank you, Mr. Gordon. Next up for 5 minutes, Madame Fortier.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Wiley.
Merci, Monsieur Wiley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wiley, for participating today. It's really important to us to hear your testimony. We heard a lot about what has happened, and I want to look more to the future. So the transformation that you mentioned several times, either of measures or ways to ensure that we can protect personal information of Canadians. And so do you have some suggestions to make to us as a committee so that we can indeed put those protective measures in place for Canadians' personal data?
The first thing that I would say, and this is a really straightforward example, which I was speaking about before, in the same way that you require transparency for donations and spending, require transparency for the use of information and advertising. So when a party puts out an ad online, it should have to report that. And it should also have to report who is it going to. I think that companies should do that too. I don't see why not. I think it would be healthy for people to be able to scrutinize the advertising markets online in general. The other thing that I would say is that we have to understand that this is not always going to be a data issue. The development of algorithms and artificial intelligence moving forward means that it will not always be clear whether or not there was consent in an inference, for example. So I'll give you a tangible example. If your cousin joins a genetic profiling company, so 23andMe, for example, that company later is acquired by an insurance company or some other kind of company that then looks at that genetic profile and infers, based on your relationship, because you're their cousin, that you have a 95% chance of having a particular type of breast cancer, right? And then, this might not be as applicable in Canada, but in the United States it absolutely is, and then denies health insurance. Now, the question here is, there was consent in the actual data because the data was the genetic profile of your cousin who consented to that use. But the behavior or action or result applies to you, where you didn't know that this was happening and you didn't consent to that. And so currently, it's difficult to say, was that information about you? Was that an inference about you? Because when we're looking at artificial intelligence, what we're looking at is memories, understandings, and behaviors, and inferences. So when we regulate people in the law about their behavior, we do have a component as to what's in their heads. But we also have another component, which is their behavior. And so taking a step back and not just looking at the issue of data and consent, but looking at the behavior and acceptable behavior of AI in general, I think is a really healthy mindset for people to have. These are decision-making machines, so we should be regulating how they can make decisions, which is really important because as society moves forward, all of this information is going to start being connected to one another. And what you do with your toaster may affect what your office computer does later down the road, right? Or what it may affect the price of Starbucks when you walk into Starbucks. You know, and there's real issues that aren't to do with consent, but are to do with the ultimate impact and behavior. So the third thing that I would say, so that's a more broad mindset. The third thing that I would say is that when you look at technology, right, this is something whether you're a Canadian or an American or a Brit or whomever, the internet is here to stay. You do not have a choice. You have to use Google. You have to use social media. You cannot get a job if you refuse to use the internet anymore, right? So this means that the issue of consent also is slightly moot because in the same way that we all have to use electricity, it's a false choice to say if you don't want to be electrocuted, don't use electricity. In the same way that if you don't want to participate in the modern economy, don't use data collection platforms, right? So looking at these platforms as a utility rather than as an entity where people are or consumers are quote unquote consenting in the same way that we would look at electricity or water or roads as a utility. The fourth thing that I would say is that there should be rules on reasonable expectations. So when I joined Facebook in 2007, right, it did not have facial profiling algorithms. I put all of my photos onto Facebook and I consent to quote unquote analysis of the data that I put on. But that technology did not yet exist. Facebook then creates facial recognition algorithms, which then reads my face, right? Was that reasonably expected at the time? For a lot of people, probably not. So, but there's very little regulation or rules on something that's very unique to technology, which is the rapid development of new things. So having some sort of rule or principle about reasonable expectation. You might have consented to some platform several years ago, but if something new happened, was that reasonably expected? If the answer is no, then maybe it shouldn't be allowed.
Thank you, Madam Forte. Next up for 5 minutes, Mr. Kent.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Wiley. And I think certainly your recommendations in terms of every political party posting the advertising that it has micro-targeted in elections is a good one. And I suspect that the commissioner, on receiving that sort of advice, may well come back and recommend it himself. When Chris Vickery, the director of cyber risk research at UpGuard, testified before this committee, he described his accidental discovery of the public website called GitHub and the subdomain called GitLab. And the website GitLabAggregateIQ.com, which he said was essentially inviting the entire world to log on, to register, and to participate in what he called a collaboration portal. Do you think that that portal was left open deliberately by AIQ so that the company or individuals in the company could have plausible deniability of what was going on within areas of that portal?
So the thing that I would say is I can't speak to the intention of AIQ. So I don't know why that misconfiguration was there. It seemed like a pretty careless, is one word you could use, oversight to have your entire code base and systems exposed to the public. And if not intentional, it certainly was extremely reckless.
Right. Did you ever avail yourself of the open accessibility of that site? Were you aware of it?
I've used GitHub as most people in tech have used GitHub, but I this particular subdomain that you're referring to, I have not accessed before. No.
Right. Were you aware of GitLab AIQ's ephemeral project? Sorry, I'm sorry for interrupting.
Well, sorry, could you be more specific?
Well, again, Chris Vickery walked us through the ephemeral project as he discovered it. That site's been taken down, but it had within it the database of truth, and then it had two different project levels to influence election outcomes. One was called Saga, and one was called Monarch. Were you familiar with these?
I'm vaguely familiar with the names. The names I'm familiar with actually is through Chris Vickery, because those weren't necessarily the names that SCL would use to refer to the products. So it's hard for me to answer specifically because I'm familiar with the general setup. So, for example, the database of truth that you're referring to, the parlance that I would use is the database of records. So I'm familiar generally with the setup, but the specific names off the top of my head, I'm not, no.
Right. On this website, and I know that there is good humor among those who are experts in terms of the digital world, but the subtitle of the ephemeral project was "Because There Is No Truth." Do you think that was just a bit of humor, or sort of an underlying reflection of the mentality of AIQ?
So I can't speak to the specific intentions of AIQ and why they put certain things there, but what I can say is that there was a systemic culture in the group of companies that we've been speaking about that completely disregarded the importance of truth in an election. The company SCL and Cambridge Analytica regularly advertised disinformation as a service offering. So I think part of it could be dark humor, and part of it could also be reflective of the fact that that kind of humor would be completely acceptable in this group of companies.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kent. Next up for 5 minutes, Mr. Bayless.
I'd like to continue on with our discussions about the foundations of Cambridge Analytica. You had said that it was set up with the specific. What was it set up? What was the intention of that setting up Cambridge Analytica?
So Robert Mercer and Steve Bannon wanted to use the services of SCL, but there were two issues. First of all, there were issues in the United States about using a foreign contractor, particularly a foreign military contractor, in domestic U.S. elections. So both in a compliance sense, in terms of that's not allowed, and then secondly, in an optics sense, that doesn't look good. So they needed a domestic U.S.-focused brand for that operations. And then secondly, Robert Mercer wanted more control over the project than simply handing it to a client would allow. So he wanted a role as an investor and as a shareholder and as a director.
And he put Steve Bannon there as the vice president. And
yes.
Then was your understanding that he was doing this for a profit motive?
Actually, no, the opposite. Because when you are that you have to remember, Robert Mercer is one of the wealthiest people in the United States. He's a billionaire. He doesn't need more money, and the contract values that you get in politics compared to corporate finance pale in comparison. So for him, he wasn't necessarily out to look for making money, particularly on political projects. He was out to play the sport of billionaires, which is to compete in elections.
This company was so poorly run, it went bankrupt, right? They've gone bankrupt. So we can look and say he didn't do it for financial profit. Now, if I set up a sign company here in Canada and I say to a given party, I'm going to sell you your political signs at a discount, I'm going to lose money because I'm a rich person and I want to, quote unquote, subsidize selling election signs that you're going to stick up, and I'm selling them under the price. I'm actually giving money indirectly, and that's against the law. Is it possible that Steve Bannon and Robert Mercer, in the structure that they did, in this money-losing operation, were also circumventing election spending limits and election spending laws, if you will?
So one of the ancillary benefits, so I can't speak to the specific intention as to whether that was the reason why it was set up this way. I mean, it was set up with an incredibly convoluted structure. But what was explained to me was that there was a benefit, which was that if you are an investor in a company, and that company then provides political services, and you put in money into that company, which then provides services at a particular rate, when you put in money into that company, that's not a donation, that's an investment in a company that you're the owner of, right? So in that way, it doesn't necessarily need to be reportable because it's an investment. If you are then putting in millions and millions and millions of dollars to generate IP, which is then worth millions and millions and millions of dollars, but you then only need to charge your clients a nominal amount, you could argue that that's a subsidy. You could argue that it's a donation in kind or it's a proxy donation. The problem in many cases in the United States is that companies are much more opaque than in other countries, so it's difficult to actually parse out how much money goes where. But that was explained to me as an ancillary benefit.
And given the fact that they also had their hands in the Brexit vote, it could also be a way of them, of a foreign entity pushing money into another country's domestic vote through Brexit. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, and I think this is in part where a vulnerability has been exposed in a lot of countries' electoral laws, which is that if you pass money into companies and then those companies then provide services for domestic clients, it's not always transparent as to where some of that money came from. So something to explore is more reporting mechanisms for companies that do engage in politics.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bayless. Last question goes to Mr. Angus. 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've received a number of questions from citizens through open media, and many of them, I think, are questioning the bigger issues in terms of regulation and how we start to move towards what you call dealing with these tech giants as utilities. But one of the questions that I think staring us in the face is, how likely is it that Cambridge Analytica, SCL, were the lone operators in this big field of election manipulation? Were there and are there other players out there that we should be aware of?
So the way I look at it is Cambridge Analytica is the canary in the coal mine. Cambridge Analytica is the beginning, it's not the end. And that what CIA has exposed is how easy it is to misappropriate information, take funds from mysterious sources, and then go and interfere in elections, particularly in cyberspace. And what it really shows is how the internet and the growing digitization of society has opened up vulnerabilities in our election system. Elections historically feel like a very domestic, insulated activity, because previously, if you were a foreign actor, you'd have to physically come to a country to interfere. Now you don't. And so I think, moving forward, we need to look at cybersecurity as a priority for elections, and that we have to understand that we may look at social media as domestic political players, as a communication space, as scoring points or messaging. If you are a malicious foreign actor, you look at it as an information battlefield. And so you don't look at these people as voters, you look at them very much as targets for manipulation and targets for division. And so I think there needs, and this is why transparency mechanisms or requirements for online platforms that do any advertising in the political space, would be a really helpful first step, because that would make it a lot more difficult for a country like Russia to start to interfere in elections if that has to be done in public.
Well, it would be really helpful if you could send our committee some recommendations that we should be looking at, because what really struck me was when we had Facebook here was they seem to have a very cavalier disregard for the damage that was done through the manipulation of their platform. And I see Facebook as having a revolutionary positive potential. Certainly in my region, connecting isolated Indigenous communities, it's been transformative. But when we ask questions on, for example, the horrific ethnic slaughter in Myanmar, and Facebook's unwillingness to police its own network or to deal with, the calls from UN NGOs, they shrugged. So how do we come up with better mechanisms to protect democratic elections, to respond to this kind of misuse of platforms by these third-party operators?
So I think one of the biggest things that I've learned in this process is I get a lot of the same questions and see a lot of the same problems with the different legislators and governments that I've been dealing with around the world. And one of the things that I've also seen is how, Mark Zuckerberg, for example, refuses to appear at any of the other committees or investigations around the world, save for Congress and his very brief meeting, if you can call it that, at the European Parliament, which means that you've got largely American companies that are exerting huge amounts of influence on the democratic systems of countries all around the world. And I think a starting point would be different legislatures and different regulators and different governments sitting down together and talking about how is it that the internet is global now, and everybody has a stake in making sure that their democracies are intact. And so what is it about the internet that needs to be looked at? What are the common questions that each country has? And working together on a common solution. And I honestly think that it may actually require a multinational approach, particularly when you see how Mark Zuckerberg refuses to engage with most countries. So I think that may have to happen at an international level or cross-parliamentary level.
So just finally, domestically, would you say that it would be in Canadians' interests to have Canadian political parties come under our Privacy Protection Act so that there is more accountability for even how political parties use this information?
Yeah, so the only issue that I think would need to really be carefully considered is if you start to require political parties to have opt-in consent before they talk to voters, or if they receive some kind of opt-out, they can never engage that voter again, you may create a situation where you have an election and the entire electorate you are unable to reach because of those barriers. Our democratic process is a very special thing, and actually I think that there is value sometimes in one party approaching a voter who doesn't initially just agree with them or doesn't even necessarily want to talk to them, because that's partly what debate and the political process is about. It's about challenging conversations. You can't have challenging conversations if we create rules that prevent political parties from actually engaging with voters. It's different for companies than with elections, but in particular with elections, I think that's a really important thing for people to think about, is that it feels good to say we should have opt-in if parties don't want to talk. If you don't want to talk to parties, they shouldn't have to bother you at the door. But actually, sometimes that's essential in maintaining our democratic process. So the only caution that I would have there is just making sure that it's not so overly restrictive that 5 years down the road, parties can't engage with the electorate.
Thank you, Mr. Wiley. Thank you, Mr. Angus, too. I have a question for you, Mr. Wiley. I have a couple, actually. We have to go to votes here in a few minutes. Are you able to stay when we come back to answer a few questions in camera?
Sure. I'm not sure what time it is at the moment, but I'm sure I can, yeah.
We've already checked that the building that you're in, it's going to be open to you to be accessible to us at least until 12:45. So that all's been already worked out. So you're free to stay. Okay, then I just have a question for you then as chair, and then we're going to go to votes and then come back. We'll come back in camera. Have you watched the testimony of Mr. Zach Massingham and Jeff Sylvester as they appeared before our committee in Canada?
I've watched parts of it. I haven't seen the entire thing.
Okay, is it your opinion that they were untruthful to our committee in watching that testimony?
My impression was that there were answers that felt obfuscated or that, as has been discussed now, so fantastical that it's hard to believe.
Okay. Just 1 second. You need unanimous. Okay, can we just have unanimous consent to continue for about 1 minute, and then we'll come back in camera? Well, thank you for your testimony, Mr. Wiley, and we trust that you'll be back when we come back. We're going to be back around 11:45-ish. So if you can go and come back, that's fine. As for the committee, we're going to be coming back to answer questions or ask questions in camera. Is that clear? Everybody, that's understood? Okay. So we'll suspend just for a few minutes, and we'll see you back, Mr. Wiley. Thank you.
Thank you.